Sarah Mitchell clutched her camera tightly as she walked through the gates of Buckingham Palace with her 8-year-old son, Tommy. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard, and dozens of tourists were already gathering for the changing of the guard ceremony. This was their first trip to London, a dream vacation that Sarah had been saving for since her husband's death 2 years ago. Tommy bounced excitedly beside her, his small hand gripping hers as they navigated through the crowd. He wore his father's old military cap, a treasured memento that had belonged to Sergeant James Mitchell, who served 3 tours in Afghanistan before a roadside bomb claimed his life. The cap was too big for Tommy's head, but he refused to leave it at the hotel. "Mum, will the guards really not move no matter what?" Tommy asked, his eyes wide with curiosity as they approached the famous red-coated sentries standing motionless at their posts. Sarah smiled down at him, adjusting the oversized cap on his head. "That's what they say, sweetheart. They're trained to stay perfectly still no matter what happens around them." The crowd began to thicken as more tourists arrived, cameras clicking and children chattering excitedly. Sarah found a good spot near the fence where Tommy could see clearly. She lifted him onto her shoulders, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility that had become her constant companion since James's death. As they waited, Sarah noticed other families around them. A group of elderly tourists from Germany were discussing the history of the palace in hushed tones. A young couple from Japan took selfies with the guards in the background. Children ran around their parents' legs, pointing and giggling at the stoic figures in their tall black hats and pristine red uniforms. Tommy was particularly fascinated by one guard who stood directly in front of them. The man was tall and imposing, with a perfectly waxed mustache and eyes that stared straight ahead, never blinking or acknowledging the crowd of people photographing him. His rifle was held at the perfect angle, and not a single thread on his uniform was out of place. "He looks like a toy soldier," Tommy whispered to his mother, causing her to chuckle softly. Sarah began taking pictures, trying to capture the moment for their photo album back home. She wanted Tommy to have memories of this trip, something positive, to look back on during the difficult times that still lay ahead. The insurance money from James's death had made this vacation possible, but it came with a heavy price that no amount of money could ever truly compensate for. As the minutes passed, more tourists gathered, creating a sea of faces from around the world. Sarah overheard conversations in French, Spanish, Italian, and languages she couldn't identify. Everyone seemed drawn to the same spectacle. These legendary guards who could stand motionless for hours, never breaking character no matter what happened around them. A group of teenagers tried to make the guard smile by making funny faces and telling jokes. They waved their hands in front of his face and even tried doing silly dances, but the soldier remained completely unmoved. His training was evident in every fiber of his being, a testament to the discipline and dedication required for such a prestigious position. Tommy watched all of this with growing amazement. "How do they do it, Mum? Don't they get tired?" "They're very well trained," Sarah explained. "It takes years of practice to become a Queen's Guard. They're some of the best soldiers in the world." As she said these words, Sarah felt a pang in her chest. James would have been proud to see Tommy's interest in military discipline and honor. Her husband had always spoken with great respect about the traditions of different military units around the world, and the Queen's Guard had been among those he admired most. The guard they were watching seemed to embody everything James had respected about military service. His posture was perfect, his uniform immaculate, and his dedication absolute. Sarah found herself thinking about the similarities between this man and her late husband. Both had chosen to serve their country. Both understood the meaning of duty and sacrifice. Tommy grew restless as they waited for the ceremony to begin. He fidgeted on Sarah's shoulders and began asking questions about everything he saw. Other children in the crowd were also getting impatient, their parents trying to keep them entertained with snacks and quiet games. "When will something happen?" Tommy asked for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. "Soon, love," Sarah replied, though she wasn't entirely sure herself. The changing of the guard ceremony was scheduled to begin at 11 o'clock, but it was still only 10:30. As they waited, Sarah noticed how the guard's eyes occasionally moved slightly, scanning the crowd for any potential threats or disturbances. Despite his statue-like appearance, he was clearly alert and aware of everything happening around him. This attention to detail reminded her of James, who had possessed the same kind of focused awareness even during their quiet moments at home. The morning air was crisp, and Sarah pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders. Tommy seemed oblivious to the cold, his excitement keeping him warm as he continued to stare at the motionless soldier. The crowd around them continued to grow, with people jostling for better positions and parents lifting small children for better views. Sarah realized that this moment represented something important for both her and Tommy. It was their first major adventure since James's death, their first step toward building new memories while honoring the old ones. The guard standing before them symbolized the kind of strength and resilience that she was trying to cultivate in herself and her son. As the clock tower chimed 10:45, Sarah felt a mixture of anticipation and sadness. She wished James could be here to share this experience, to answer Tommy's endless questions about military traditions and to lift their son on his strong shoulders. But she was determined to make this trip meaningful for Tommy, to give him something positive to remember about this difficult period in their lives. The crowd continued to swell as the ceremony time approached. Sarah could feel the excitement building around them, with tourists positioning themselves for the best photographs and videos. Tommy had grown tired of sitting on her shoulders, so she set him down, keeping a firm grip on his hand as people pressed closer to the fence. "Stay close to me," she whispered to Tommy, who nodded solemnly while adjusting his father's military cap. Just then, a commotion erupted near the back of the crowd. A family was arguing loudly in what sounded like American accents, their voices carrying over the general murmur of conversation. The father was complaining about not being able to see properly, while his teenage daughter was mortified by his increasingly loud demands for people to move. "This is ridiculous," the man shouted. "We paid good money to come here, and these people are blocking our view." Other tourists began turning around, some looking annoyed while others appeared sympathetic. Sarah instinctively pulled Tommy closer, not wanting him to be caught up in any potential conflict. She had learned to be protective of their space and peace since becoming a single mother. The guard they had been watching remained completely motionless despite the disturbance happening just meters away. His training was remarkable. Not even the slightest twitch of an eye or movement of a muscle betrayed any awareness of the argument behind him. This level of discipline fascinated Tommy, who had stopped paying attention to the arguing tourists and was instead studying the soldier's perfect stillness. "Look, Mum," Tommy whispered, pointing at the guard's hands. "He's not even breathing hard." Sarah looked more closely and realized her son was right. The guard's breathing was so controlled and steady that his chest barely moved. Every aspect of his posture spoke of years of rigorous training and an unwavering commitment to his duty. As the argument behind them continued to escalate, other guards in the vicinity remained equally unmoved. It was as if they existed in a different world, one where the chaos and noise of civilian life could not penetrate their professional bubble. Sarah found this somehow comforting. In a world that had become unpredictable and painful since James's death, there was something reassuring about this display of absolute consistency and reliability. A tour guide with a small group of elderly visitors approached their area, speaking in a hushed but carrying voice about the history of the Queen's Guard. Sarah and Tommy listened with interest as the woman explained the rigorous selection process, the months of training, and the honor associated with being chosen for this prestigious duty. "These men are not just ceremonial figures," the guide explained to her group. "They are active duty soldiers who have served in combat zones around the world. Many have been deployed to Afghanistan, Iraq, and other areas of conflict before being selected for palace duty." Sarah's breath caught in her throat at the mention of Afghanistan. She glanced down at Tommy, wondering if he had made the same connection she had. Her son was listening intently, his small face serious beneath the brim of his father's cap. The guide continued her explanation, detailing the famous incidents where guards had maintained their positions despite various disruptions. Tourists trying to make them laugh, protesters attempting to get their attention, and even emergency situations where they had remained at their posts until properly relieved. Tommy tugged at Sarah's jacket. "Mum, do you think this guard was in Afghanistan?" "Like Dad?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had been trying to prepare herself for these kinds of connections, but they still took her by surprise. She knelt down to Tommy's level, looking into his earnest brown eyes that reminded her so much of James. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said softly. "But it's possible. Many of these guards have served all over the world, just like your father did." Tommy nodded thoughtfully, then turned back to study the guard with renewed interest. Sarah could see the wheels turning in his young mind, trying to process the connection between this impressive figure and his memories of his father. The argument behind them had finally died down, with the disgruntled family moving to a different location. The crowd settled back into its patient waiting, the atmosphere returning to one of respectful anticipation. Sarah noticed that several people were now watching Tommy with gentle smiles, perhaps recognizing something special about the small boy in the oversized military cap who was studying the guard with such intense concentration. An elderly British couple standing nearby struck up a quiet conversation with Sarah. The woman complimented Tommy's cap and asked about their visit to London. When Sarah mentioned they were from Manchester and that this was their first major trip since her husband's death, the woman's expression softened with understanding. "Military family?" the elderly man asked quietly, nodding toward Tommy's cap. "My husband served 3 tours in Afghanistan," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The couple exchanged a meaningful look, and the woman reached out to gently squeeze Sarah's arm. "These lads standing guard," she said, gesturing toward the motionless soldiers. "They understand what your husband gave. There's a brotherhood there that goes beyond ceremony." Sarah felt tears threatening to spill over, but she blinked them back. She wasn't ready for the emotional weight of this conversation, not here in front of Tommy and all these strangers. But there was something comforting about the older woman's words, a recognition that she and Tommy weren't alone in their experience of loss and sacrifice. Tommy had been listening to parts of this conversation while continuing to watch the guard. Sarah could see that he was processing everything: the information about the guard's military service, the connection to his father's experience, and the solemn respect that seemed to surround these men who stood so perfectly still. The clock tower chimed 11 o'clock, and suddenly the atmosphere changed. The ceremonial preparations were about to begin, and the crowd pressed forward with renewed anticipation. Sarah lifted Tommy back onto her shoulders so he could see over the heads of the adults in front of them. As the first sounds of military commands echoed across the courtyard, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and emotion. This was the moment they had been waiting for, but it was also a moment that connected them to James in an unexpected way. She could almost hear his voice explaining the significance of what they were witnessing, his pride in military tradition evident in every word. The sound of marching boots echoed across the courtyard as the new guard contingent approached. Tommy's eyes widened with amazement as he watched the perfectly synchronized movement of the soldiers, their red uniforms creating a striking contrast against the gray stone of the palace. From his perch on Sarah's shoulders, he had an excellent view of the entire ceremony unfolding before them. "Look at how they all move together," Tommy whispered to his mother, his voice filled with wonder. Sarah adjusted her grip on his legs, making sure he was secure as the crowd pressed forward for better views. The precision of the marching was indeed impressive, every step taken in perfect unison, every rifle held at exactly the same angle, every face displaying the same expression of focused professionalism. The guard they had been watching remained motionless at his post, even as his replacement unit approached. Sarah found herself holding her breath, wondering what it must feel like to maintain such perfect stillness while surrounded by so much activity and noise. The discipline required was almost superhuman, a testament to the rigorous training these men underwent. Tommy began asking questions in rapid succession, his curiosity getting the better of him despite Sarah's attempts to keep him quiet during the ceremony. "Why don't they smile? How long can they stand like that? Do their feet hurt?" An elderly gentleman standing nearby overheard Tommy's questions and leaned over with a kind smile. I was a guardsman myself 40 years ago, he said quietly. We learn to focus on our duty above everything else. The discomfort becomes secondary to the honor of serving. Sarah thanked the man for his explanation, grateful for the way he had spoken to Tommy with such patience and respect. She could see that her son was absorbing every word, his young mind trying to understand the concept of duty and service that had been so important to his father. As the ceremony continued, the commands rang out across the courtyard in crisp, authoritative voices. The tourists fell largely silent, recognizing the solemnity of what they were witnessing. Even the children in the crowd seemed to sense that this was something special, something that deserved their attention and respect. Sarah noticed that Tommy had grown very still on her shoulders. When she glanced up at him, she saw that he was studying the face of their guard with intense concentration. The soldier's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but there was something in his expression that seemed to have captured Tommy's attention. "Mum," Tommy said softly. He looked sad. Sarah looked more carefully at the guard's face, trying to see what her perceptive son had noticed. Beneath the professional mask of military discipline, there was indeed something in the man's eyes, a depth that spoke of experiences beyond the pageantry of palace duty. She wondered about his story, about the places he had served and the things he had seen. The changing of the guard ceremony reached its climax as the old guard began to march away and the new sentries took their positions. The precision was flawless, each movement executed with the timing of a carefully choreographed dance. The crowd began to applaud, and camera flashes lit up the courtyard as tourists captured the moment. But just as the ceremony was concluding, something unexpected happened. Tommy's military cap, which had been precariously balanced on his head throughout the morning, was caught by a sudden gust of wind. Sarah watched in horror as the precious memento, her late husband's cap, was blown from Tommy's head and skittered across the ground toward the fence. "Dad's hat!" Tommy cried out, his voice cracking with distress. Several tourists tried to help, reaching for the cap as it rolled past them, but it continued to move, driven by the persistent wind. Sarah quickly set Tommy down and began pushing through the crowd, desperate to retrieve the one physical reminder of James that Tommy treasured most. The cap came to rest directly in front of the new guard who had just taken position, the same spot where their original guard had been standing. Sarah's heart sank as she realized it was now in an area where tourists couldn't reach, separated from them by the ceremonial barriers and the guard's post. Tommy pressed against the fence, tears streaming down his face as he watched his father's cap lying on the ground just meters away but completely inaccessible. "We have to get it back," he sobbed. "It's all I have left of him." Sarah felt her own tears beginning to fall as she knelt beside her son. She knew how important that cap was to him. He slept with it beside his bed every night and wore it whenever he missed his father most. Losing it would be devastating, but there seemed to be no way to retrieve it without disrupting the guard's post. Other tourists had noticed their distress, and several people offered suggestions for how they might get the cap back. Someone suggested waiting until the guard's shift ended, while another person proposed asking one of the police officers for help. But none of these solutions seemed practical or likely to succeed. The new guard stood perfectly still, the cap lying at his feet like a small, poignant reminder of civilian life intruding on military ceremony. Sarah could see Tommy's shoulders shaking with silent sobs, and her heart broke for her son's pain. This trip was supposed to be about creating positive memories, but instead, it was turning into another source of grief and loss. As the crowd began to disperse, many tourists offered sympathetic words and suggestions, but none could offer a real solution to their problem. Sarah felt helpless and frustrated, angry at herself for not securing the cap more carefully and angry at the wind for choosing this moment to snatch away something so precious. Tommy wiped his nose with his sleeve and looked up at the guard with desperate hope. "Please," he whispered, even though he knew the soldier couldn't acknowledge him. "That was my dad's hat. He was a soldier too, just like you." The guard remained motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead, giving no indication that he had heard Tommy's plea. but Sarah thought she detected the slightest change in his expression, a subtle softening around the eyes that suggested he was not as oblivious to their situation as his training required him to appear. As minutes passed and the crowd continued to thin, Sarah realized they might have to accept the loss of the cap. The thought of having to explain this to Tommy, of seeing his heart break, was almost unbearable. She had already failed to protect him from so much pain, losing his father, adjusting to their new life, dealing with the constant reminders of their loss. Now she had failed to protect the one physical connection he had to James's memory. As the crowd continued to disperse, Sarah and Tommy remained by the fence, both staring at the military cap that lay tantalizingly close, yet impossibly out of reach. The new guard stood perfectly still above it, his polished boots just inches from the cherished memento. Tommy had stopped crying, but his face showed the resigned sadness of a child who had learned too early that life sometimes takes away the things you love most. Sarah felt a deep ache in her chest as she watched her son's quiet acceptance of yet another loss. At 8 years old, Tommy had already experienced more grief than many adults ever would. First his father's death, then the difficult adjustment to life without him, and now this, the loss of his most treasured connection to his dad's memory. "Maybe we should go," Sarah said gently, placing her hand on Tommy's shoulder. "We can ask at the information desk if there's anything they can do later." Tommy nodded without taking his eyes off the cap. "Okay, Mum, but can we wait just a few more minutes, please?" Sarah agreed, understanding her son's reluctance to leave. Walking away felt like abandoning hope, like giving up on recovering this precious piece of their past. She knew that James's military cap represented more than just fabric and thread to Tommy. It was proof that his father had been real, had been brave, had served his country with honor. A small group of tourists remained nearby, some still taking photographs while others chatted quietly about the ceremony they had just witnessed. Sarah noticed that a few people kept glancing toward them with sympathetic expressions, clearly aware of their situation, but unsure how to help. The guard himself had not moved a muscle since taking his position. His face remained impassive, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd. But Sarah found herself studying his features more closely, looking for any sign that he was aware of the drama unfolding at his feet. Tommy suddenly straightened up, pointing toward the guard. "Mum, look at his hands." Sarah followed her son's gaze and saw that the guard's knuckles had grown slightly white where he gripped his rifle. It was such a subtle change that most people would never notice it, but Tommy's observation suggested that the soldier was not as unaffected by their situation as he appeared. "He knows about the cap," Tommy whispered with growing excitement. "He can see it there. Maybe he wants to help but can't because of the rules." Sarah felt a flicker of hope at her son's words, though she tried not to let it grow too strong. Even if the guard was aware of their situation, his duty required him to remain motionless and silent. Breaking character for any reason could have serious consequences for his career and the reputation of the Queen's Guard. Minutes passed in silence, with Tommy and Sarah maintaining their vigil by the fence. The guard's shift would last for hours, and there seemed little point in waiting indefinitely, yet neither of them could bring themselves to walk away from James's cap, lying there like a small symbol of all they had lost. Just as Sarah was preparing to insist they leave, she noticed something extraordinary happening. The guard's eyes, which had been staring straight ahead, began to move almost imperceptibly downward. It was such a slight movement that anyone not watching closely would miss it entirely, but Sarah and Tommy both saw it clearly. The soldier was looking at the cap. Tommy grabbed his mother's arm, his voice barely containing his excitement. "He sees it, Mum. He's looking at Dad's hat." Sarah held her breath, afraid to move or speak in case it broke whatever spell was allowing this moment to unfold. The guard's gaze lingered on the cap for several seconds before slowly returning to its forward position. But something in his expression had changed, a barely perceptible softening that suggested he understood the significance of what lay at his feet. More tourists had gathered again, drawn by word of the cap incident that had spread through the crowd. Some people were taking photos of Tommy and Sarah at the fence, perhaps moved by the poignant scene of a young boy trying to recover his father's military memento. An older woman approached Sarah with tears in her eyes. "I heard about what happened," she said softly. "My own husband served in the Falklands. I can't imagine losing his things." Sarah thanked the woman for her kindness, though she found it difficult to speak past the emotion in her throat. The support of strangers was touching, but it couldn't solve their immediate problem. The cap remained out of reach and the guard remained bound by his duty to stay perfectly still. Tommy had grown very quiet, his small face pressed against the fence as he continued to study the guard. Sarah could see her son's mind working, trying to find some way to communicate with the soldier or to retrieve his precious cap. "What if I told him about Dad?" Tommy asked suddenly. "What if I explained that Dad was a soldier too, and that the cap is all I have left?" Sarah's heart clenched at her son's innocent hope. "Sweetheart, the guard can't talk to us. It's against the rules. He has to stay still and quiet no matter what happens." But even as she spoke these words, Sarah found herself wondering if there might be some way to reach the man behind the uniform. The subtle changes in his expression suggested that he was not immune to their situation, despite his training and professional obligations. Tommy took a step closer to the fence, his voice barely above a whisper as he spoke to the motionless figure. "Sir, my name is Tommy Mitchell. My dad was Sergeant James Mitchell. He served 3 tours in Afghanistan before he died. That cap belonged to him, and it's the only thing I have that still smells like him." The guard gave no outward sign that he had heard these words, but Sarah thought she detected another almost invisible change in his posture. His breathing seemed to have deepened slightly, and there was something in the set of his jaw that hadn't been there before. Tommy continued speaking, his young voice carrying the weight of grief and hope. "I know you can't move or talk, but I wanted you to know that my dad would have been proud to meet you. He always said that soldiers look out for each other." Sarah felt tears rolling down her cheeks as she listened to her son's heartfelt words. Tommy was speaking with a maturity that no 8-year-old should possess, shaped by loss into someone who understood both the pain of sacrifice and the bonds that connected those who served. The moment stretched on, with Tommy's words seeming to hang in the air between him and the silent guard. Other tourists had grown quiet, sensing that something important was happening even if they didn't understand all the details. The silence that followed Tommy's heartfelt words seemed to stretch for an eternity. Sarah watched her son's face as he continued to stare up at the guard, hope and desperation warring in his young features. The soldier remained perfectly still, but Sarah found herself holding her breath, sensing that something was building in this moment of connection between her son and the man who stood frozen in duty. Around them, the remaining tourists had grown unusually quiet, as if they too could feel the weight of what was happening. Several people held their phones and cameras ready, but out of respect for the solemnity of the moment, they refrained from taking pictures. Even the children in the crowd seemed to understand that this was something special, something that deserved their reverent attention. Tommy pressed his small hands against the fence, his knuckles white with the intensity of his grip. "Please," he whispered one more time, his voice barely audible. "I know you understand what it means to serve. My dad did too." For several more seconds, nothing happened. The guard continued to stare straight ahead, his rifle held at the perfect angle, his posture unchanged. Sarah began to prepare herself to gently lead Tommy away, to help him accept that some things in life simply couldn't be fixed or recovered. But then, something extraordinary occurred. The guard's right foot, which had been planted firmly in regulation position, began to move. It was the slightest adjustment at first, so subtle that only those watching closely would notice it. But gradually, unmistakably, he shifted his weight and took a small step backward. Tommy gasped, his eyes widening as he realized what was happening. The guard was moving deliberately and purposefully, in a way that would allow him to access the cap without completely abandoning his post. With movements that were precise and controlled, never losing his military bearing, the guard continued, his careful repositioning. His eyes remained fixed forward, but his actions spoke of a decision that went beyond duty and regulation. He was choosing to help, despite the potential consequences to his career and reputation. Sarah felt her heart pounding as she watched this unprecedented display of compassion. She had heard stories about the Queen's Guard never breaking character, never acknowledging the public or responding to any situation. Yet here was one of these legendary soldiers, risking his position to help a grieving child recover his father's memory. The crowd around them began to realize what was happening, and a collective intake of breath rippled through the tourists. Cameras and phones were raised, but people seemed hesitant to capture this moment, as if recording it might somehow diminish its power or authenticity. With one final, carefully calculated movement, the guard positioned himself so that the cap was within reach of his left foot. Still maintaining his forward gaze and his grip on his rifle, he gently nudged the military cap with the toe of his polished boot, sending it sliding across the smooth stones toward the fence where Tommy waited. The cap came to rest just inches from Tommy's outstretched hand, close enough that he could reach through the fence and grasp it. With trembling fingers, the boy retrieved his father's most precious memento, clutching it to his chest as tears of relief and gratitude streamed down his face. "Thank you," Tommy whispered to the guard, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much." The guard had already resumed his original position, standing perfectly still as if nothing had happened, but Sarah could see the slight smile that ghosted across his lips for just a moment, a barely perceptible acknowledgement of Tommy's gratitude and his own satisfaction at being able to help. The crowd around them erupted in spontaneous applause, their appreciation for what they had witnessed overcoming any concern about disturbing the solemn atmosphere of the palace grounds. People were wiping away tears, hugging their own children tighter and speaking in hushed, amazed tones about the compassion they had just observed. Sarah knelt down beside Tommy, who was carefully placing his father's cap back on his head. The oversized military headgear sat at its familiar awkward angle, but it had never looked more precious or important than it did in that moment. "Did you see what he did, Mum?" Tommy asked, his face shining with wonder and gratitude. "He broke the rules to help us. He risked getting in trouble just to give me back Dad's hat." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in her throat. She had witnessed something extraordinary, an act of human kindness that transcended duty, regulation, and protocol. The guard had seen a child in distress and had chosen compassion over conformity, understanding that some things were more important than following rules to the letter. As they prepared to leave, Sarah took one last look at the guard who had shown them such unexpected kindness. He stood as motionless as ever, his eyes fixed on the horizon, giving no outward sign of what had just transpired. But she would never forget his face, never forget the moment when duty and humanity had intersected in the most beautiful way possible. Tommy waved goodbye to the guard, even though he knew the soldier couldn't acknowledge the gesture. "I'll never forget you," he said softly, "and I'll tell everyone about how brave and kind you are." Other tourists were still talking excitedly about what they had witnessed, some calling it the most moving thing they had ever seen, others describing it as a moment that restored their faith in human decency. Sarah overheard several people saying they would tell this story for the rest of their lives, that they had been privileged to witness something truly special. As they walked away from the fence, Tommy reached up to take his mother's hand. The weight of his father's cap on his head seemed to give him comfort and confidence, just as it always had. But now it carried an additional meaning. It was not just a reminder of his father's service, but also of the brotherhood that existed among those who served, and the kindness that could emerge in the most unexpected moments. Sarah squeezed Tommy's hand, feeling a sense of closure and healing that she hadn't expected to find on this vacation. They had come to London as tourists, hoping to create some positive memories after so much sadness. Instead, they had experienced something that would stay with them forever. A reminder that kindness and compassion could still be found in the world, even in the most unlikely circumstances. 3 months later, Sarah sat at her kitchen table in Manchester, scrolling through the hundreds of emails and messages that had poured in from around the world. The video of the guard helping Tommy retrieve his father's cap had been shared millions of times across social media platforms, touching hearts in countries she had never even visited. Tommy was at school, proudly wearing his father's military cap as he did every day now. The incident at Buckingham Palace had given him a new confidence, a deeper understanding of what it meant to be connected to something larger than himself. He often talked about the guard who had helped him, referring to him as my friend the soldier when telling the story to anyone who would listen. The response to their story had been overwhelming in the best possible way. Military families from around the globe had reached out to share their own experiences of loss and resilience. Veterans had written to describe how the Guard's actions had reminded them why they had chosen to serve. Parents had explained how they had used the story to teach their children about compassion and courage. One particularly moving message had come from a retired colonel who had served alongside James in Afghanistan. He wrote about how proud James would have been to see his son's respectful interaction with the Guard, and how the incident perfectly exemplified the values that military families held dear. The man had included a photograph of himself with James, taken during their deployment, which now sat framed on Sarah's mantelpiece next to other precious memories. The British media had picked up the story, with several newspapers running features about the Guard's actions and the tradition of military brotherhood that had inspired them. While the Guard's identity had never been revealed to protect his privacy, the palace had issued a statement acknowledging the incident and expressing pride in the compassion shown by their personnel. Sarah had been contacted by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell their story as part of a larger project about military families and the bonds that sustain them through difficult times. She had politely declined, feeling that their experience was too personal and precious to be turned into entertainment. But the filmmaker's interest had made her realize how many people had been touched by what they witnessed that day at the palace. The most unexpected development had come 2 weeks ago, when Sarah received a formal letter with the royal seal. Inside was an invitation for her and Tommy to attend a private ceremony at Windsor Castle, where several military families would be honored for their service and sacrifice. The letter didn't mention the incident with the Guard directly, but Sarah understood that their story had somehow reached the attention of those in the highest circles. Tommy had been beside himself with excitement about the invitation, though he was most interested in the possibility that he might see his friend the soldier again. Sarah had tried to explain that the chances were very slim, given the number of guards who served at various royal residences. But Tommy remained optimistic, in the way that only children can. The ripple effects of that single act of kindness continued to spread in ways Sarah never could have imagined. A children's charity had contacted her about using their story to help other military children cope with loss. A publisher had approached her about writing a book. Most surprisingly, she had received a call from the Ministry of Defense, asking if she would be willing to speak to soldiers about the importance of their ceremonial duties and how their actions, even small ones, could have profound impacts on the public. But perhaps the most meaningful response had come from other Queen's Guards themselves. Through various intermediaries, she had received messages from current and former guardsmen expressing their support and explaining how the incident had reminded them of why they were proud to serve in such a visible role. Several mentioned that they had been deployed to Afghanistan at the same time as James, creating an unexpected connection across time and tragedy. Tommy's teacher had noticed a significant change in him since their return from London. Where he had once been withdrawn and reluctant to talk about his father, he now spoke openly about James's service and the pride he felt in being a military child. The incident had somehow transformed his grief into something more manageable, not eliminating the sadness, but giving it context and meaning within a larger story of service and sacrifice. Sarah often found herself thinking about the Guard, who had made such a difference in their lives with one simple act. She wondered about his background, his own service record, whether he had family members who served. Most of all, she wondered if he understood the magnitude of what his compassion had accomplished, not just for Tommy, but for everyone who had witnessed or heard about his actions. The anniversary of James's death was approaching, and for the first time since losing him, Sarah felt ready to face it with something other than overwhelming sadness. Tommy had suggested they visit the Imperial War Museum to learn more about military history, and then perhaps take another trip to London to see the changing of the Guard again. Not to recreate their first experience, but to honor it and the connections it had created. As she finished reading through the latest batch of messages, Sarah came across one that made her catch her breath. It was from a woman in Australia whose Husband had also been killed in Afghanistan, leaving her to raise their young daughter alone. The woman wrote about how seeing the video of the guard helping Tommy had given her hope during a particularly dark period, showing her that there were still people in the world who understood the weight of military sacrifice and were willing to act on that understanding. The message ended with a simple line that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Your son's courage in speaking to that guard, and the guard's courage in responding, reminded me that we are not alone in this. There are invisible threads connecting all of us who have loved someone in uniform, and sometimes those threads become visible in the most beautiful ways. Sarah closed her laptop and walked to the window, where she could see Tommy walking up the path from school, his father's cap slightly askew as always, his backpack bouncing with each step. He was talking animatedly to a friend about something, his hands gesturing excitedly as he told what was undoubtedly another version of their London adventure. When Tommy burst through the front door full of stories about his day, Sarah pulled him into a tight hug. How was school, love? Great. I told Mrs. Peterson about the invitation to Windsor Castle, and she said our whole class can write letters to send with us. She wants to know if we think the Queen knows about what happened. Sarah smiled, marveling at how this experience had opened up Tommy's world in ways she never could have anticipated. What had begun as a simple tourist visit had become a story of connection, compassion, and the enduring bonds that unite those touched by military service. As they sat down for their afternoon snack, Tommy carefully placed his father's cap on the table beside them, treating it with the same reverence he always had, but now with an additional layer of meaning. It was no longer just a reminder of loss, but also a symbol of the unexpected kindness that could emerge from shared understanding and the unspoken brotherhood of those who serve. Mum, Tommy said, taking a bite of his sandwich, do you think Dad knows about what happened with the guard? Sarah reached over to straighten the cap slightly, her fingers tracing the familiar fabric that had once belonged to her husband. I think he does, sweetheart, and I think he's very proud of both of us. Outside, the Manchester rain began to fall, but inside their small kitchen, warmed by memories and strengthened by the knowledge that they were part of something larger than their immediate grief, Sarah and Tommy began planning their return visit to London, carrying with them the story of how one guard's moment of compassion had reminded them that they were never truly alone.